Good evening, welcome to everyone. Welcome to our AJA Zoom events, both to our regulars and any new people this week. Welcome also to those watching on Facebook and to anybody listening to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday and Sundays at 4 p.m. on J-Air Jewish Community Radio, which is at FM 88 in Melbourne, or for everyone else, j-air.com.au. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association. Also visible on your screen is David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as Michael Bird, who's going to be involved tonight. And our guest for tonight, Professor Alan Johnson from BICOM. We'll explain a bit more in a moment. And the topic tonight is why Israel is not a settler society. The format will be a presentation or a talk from Alan, and then we'll take some questions. If you do want to ask a question, for those that are new to these sessions, the way to indicate that you want to ask a question is to raise your hand electronically, and you do that by clicking on the reaction button. That then lets us know that you want to ask a question, and we put you in the queue. Written questions can also be placed on the chat function, and Robert Gregory, our Director of Public Affairs, will read some of them out during question time. You can disable the chat if you don't like if you don't like it, if you find all of the comments distracting. Okay, so this audience does not need reminding that one of the problems the Jewish world faces is a relentless campaign by anti-Zionists to portray Israel as a colonial settler society. It forms the basis of far-left politics. It's all over social media and is now making its way into the mainstream media. The story is familiar and it goes like this. After World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, a world racked with guilt allowed Jews to barge into land belonging to an ancient and indigenous Palestinian culture. The Jews then threw the locals out of their houses and stole their land. One person who took a public stand to refute this lie is Professor Alan Johnson, who Michael and I had the pleasure of meeting for nothing left when he was in Australia a few years ago. Alan was a professor of democratic theory and practice at Edge Hill University before joining Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre, or BICOM, in 2011, and is the founder and editor of its quarterly online journal called Fathom. Politically, Alan probably sits more to the left on the political spectrum than we might. I would say that he's a bit similar to Michael Danby, but we have no problem with that. And Alan, it's nice to catch up with you again, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so Alan, you wrote a very public letter to a prominent musician on this issue. So I'll hand over you and you can tell us the story.
Thanks very much. And thanks for inviting me. I'll make a few preliminary remarks before we get into our main subject. First, it's been a while since I've been contacted before a meeting and advised not to take part in it. But I was before this one by some Australian left-wingers that I know. One even told me, I would hate to see you lose your excellent reputation. Charming. So look, just to make that clear, I do not boycott conservatives and I don't think anyone else should. I'm not here to comment on Australian politics and definitely not on internal Jewish community politics. I'm for free speech and open debate, and I detest cancel culture. So that's that. Second, a word about Fathom, the journal I founded and edit. The tagline is for a deeper understanding of Israel and the region. There's now 10 years of content, articles, interviews, reviews, all free, all online, all written by expert voices from the left, right, and centre, Israelis and Palestinians. So check it out, please. A little background to the debate. I debated the man who I think has probably done most to popularise this paradigm, let's call it that, the settler-colonialist paradigm, Ian Pape, an Israeli academic now resident in the UK. And I've debated Ian on campuses. So I had to spend a lot of time reading their arguments. And then last year, as you say, about 100 artists, including Peter Gabriel, wrote an open letter indicting Israel as a illegitimate because settler colonialist society. And I wrote a reply. If those who know that reply, apologies, I'm going to review those arguments because they are the key arguments. Let's start off with an old Soviet joke. One Muscovite says to another, the past is being rewritten so fast that we just don't know what will happen yesterday. One easy way to understand what's going on with the settler colonialist paradigm is settler colonialism is a way for anti-Zionists to rewrite yesterday. Settler colonialism is a way for anti-Zionists to rewrite yesterday. It's a new way of talking about Israel, which throws overboard the idea that there are two peoples involved in a tragic and unresolved national question, and what's required is mutual recognition, talking, compromise, negotiations, and an accommodation between the two peoples, whatever form and shape that would take. That paradigm is pushed out, and in its place is the idea that Israel is a settler colonial society, just like America, just like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The Jews are cast as the white, European, invading settler colonialists, and the Palestinians, as you said in the introduction, are given the role of the black indigenous. It really is that crude. This is Ian Pabe's book on Palestine, and Ian Pabe says, the story of Palestine has been told before. European settlers coming to a foreign land, settling there, and either committing genocide against or expelling the indigenous people. The Zionists have not invented anything new. It's really that crude. If we accept that view, then here presto, the conflict is very easy to grasp. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict now starts to look like Derek Chauvin and George Floyd. The racist white European colonialist Jews, we are told, invaded Palestine, a foreign land to them, and they collectively knelt on the neck of the indigenous Arabs. Israel is therefore an illegitimate racist society with no right to exist. So let's end it and let's chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So what's wrong with that paradigm? Pretty much everything, but I'll group what's wrong with it into, firstly, what's wrong with it as an analysis, and secondly, what's wrong with it as a politics, because it really matters because of the awful politics which is encoded within the settler colonial framework. Everything you need to know about the conflict and so make a useful contribution to its resolution is erased by the paradigm. It misses everything that distinguishes the Jewish experience and return to Palestine from white European settler colonialism. I'm going to go through a short list of 4 big differences. And that means I'm not going to dwell on some facts which we often talk about, such as, unlike in the case of America, the Jews in Palestine, the Yishuv, had no imperial sponsor, that the Jews bought the land, often from absentee landowners, that they did not seek to conquer and subjugate the Palestinian Arabs when they got there, that they had no civilizing mission for the Arabs. The whole idea of return was to redeem the Jew, not to remake the Arab. And all those points are right, and they're often made, and they're good points to make. But instead, I'll focus on what I think are 4 absolutely fundamental differences which make the Israeli experience very different. The first difference is the intimate Jewish relationship to the land. The settler colonial paradigm misses everything that's historically and religiously distinctive about the Jewish relationship to the land of Israel, Palestine. That relationship is utterly unlike anything you can find in any of the societies described as settler colonial. The Jews were returning to a land that had been theirs, in which their religion was born, their temple was built, their matriarchs and patriarchs walked. The land that was at the absolute center of Judaism and Jewish peoplehood, a land from which they'd been forcibly expelled. They're a homeland people. And by the way, they were also the majority in Jerusalem since the 19th century. So that's the first huge difference right there. And if it were only that, if that were the only difference, it would be enough to make the label settler colonialism completely ridiculous. One of those ideas that, as George Orwell said, are so idiotic, you can only get the intellectuals to believe in them. There's a lot of those ideas around at the moment, by the way. But it isn't only that. The second major fundamental difference is the exceptional history of Jewish persecution. The paradigm, the settler colonial paradigm, erases the crushing material weight of Europe's anti-Semitic history as a driver to the rise of Zionism and to the return to Israel. and the creation of a Jewish state. In brief, to review the developments, the way that history went, the collapse of the post-1789 liberal and emancipatory society as far as it emerged, the vicious backlash against the limited inclusion of Jews in European societies in the late 19th century. And by the way, that was a backlash that was a high intellectual backlash, Europe's top philosophers, down to a low popular backlash on European streets. And then the radicalization of European anti-Semitism in the 20th century, culminating in the Holocaust. Now, why that matters so much was made clear by an Israeli left-wing historian, Ziv Sternhell, sadly passed away a few years ago, when he was demolishing the settler colonialism argument in a Marxist journal, the New Left Review, in 2010, in a superb article called In Defense of Liberal Zionism. And Ziv Sternhell said in the bluntest possible terms to Gabriel Peterberg, who's one of the architects of this paradigm, that, and these are Sternhell's words, not mine, they're very blunt words. And Sternhell simply said to him, look, Europe vomited up its Jews. And Jewish history went in another direction because of that. And you have to accept that. Religious persecution certainly drove some people onto the Mayflower in 1620, but the exceptional Jewish experience of persecution over millennia and its culmination in a rupture in world history, a rupture in Jewish history that was the Shoah, made the creation of a Jewish state in the land of Israel nothing like the creation of a settler colonial societies elsewhere. Now, the left used to see that. There's a reason why the Marxist Isaac Deutscher in the 1940s and 1950s wrote about Israel as a refuge state, a refuge for the Jews, to be defended by progressives. And he confessed he'd been quite wrong to be an anti-Zionist in the 1930s. So for me, to call Jews who fled an anti-Semitic Europe, or who staggered out of Auschwitz, propping up their skeletal bodies on each other, racist settler colonialists, is obscene. Obscene is the word that I would use for it. The third major difference is what I call the fact of Jewish indigeneity. So this argument often is played out in terms of invading European white settlers against indigenous Black people. What it erases in terms of the Israeli experience is around 800,000 Jews moved to Israel from the Arab lands in the late 1940s. They were moving within a region in which they had lived for millennia. Most were driven out of those homelands by Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism. And by the way, that's a huge subject, which is routinely ignored or covered over by those who advocate for the paradigm. These people arrived in Israel as refugees, most carrying the one suitcase. They'd been given 24 hours to pack after all these years of residence. So if it's indigeneity and persecution you're looking for, here it is. This time on the Jewish side of the ledger. If you see that experience plain, and you realize that what you're looking at is the very opposite of a white European settler racist colonialism. And I think, again, to apply those accusatory labels to those Jews from the Arab lands who went through that traumatic experience is obscene. Fourth major difference is that the international community was a partner and a superintendent, if you like, in the creation of Israel. The settler colonialism paradigm erases the facts about a series of international community mandates that nurtured the new Jewish state into being, just as was happening, by the way, for Arab peoples at the same time in the same region. So again, the League of Nations and the United Nations superintendence of the creation of Israel is utterly unlike anything experienced by any of the other so-called settler colonial societies. And just to make the point, had the Palestinians done as the Jews did in 47 and 48 and accepted the UN partition plan, instead of starting a war to drive the Jews into the sea and losing it, we would now be celebrating the 74th anniversary of the state of Palestine. So to sum that part up, the settler colonialism paradigm, I think, is analytically useless. It ignores the intimate Jewish relationship to the land. It ignores the exceptional Jewish experience of persecution. It ignores the inconvenient facts, inconvenient for them, of Jewish indigeneity and Blackness, if you like. And it ignores the international community superintendence of the creation of Israel. Combine those 4 differences. And in the technical academic terms, you've got what's called a paradigm break. You can stretch a paradigm so far, and at a certain point, trying to apply it to an experience, it just falls apart. And it falls apart in relationship to Israel. There's a 5th error, which is, to speak in a little more academic terms for 1 minute, which I call analytical lumping, and my friend David Hirsch calls explanatory flattening. Technical terms, what do I mean? All difference is erased. Zionists are Zionists are Zionists, full stop. So differences of left and right and religious and secular and different movements and different perspectives, all that rich plurality and variety that we know about inside that story of the return is all completely erased. All Jews are settlers, all settlers are racists and genocidists, so we can flatten everything out. All the explanations can be simplified and reduced to the idea of an oppressive group arriving from overseas and displacing the indigenous. What's going on with that, by the way, is that the Jew of classical anti-Semitism, when you hear classical anti-Semites talk, they talk about the Jew, whether they're from the left or right, religious or secular. And what you get today is people talking about the Zionists or global Zionism, and the same reductive simplification until you can create a dehumanized group that you can then develop a discourse around, which is demonizing and dehumanizing as a preparation for violence, is going on in both classical anti-Semitism and contemporary anti-Semitism. Right, the politics, all of that radically false analysis is a way of preparing a certain kind of politics. It isn't constructive at all in terms of peace building. It doesn't acknowledge the kinds of things that are necessary in order to bring two peoples who've been in conflict for a century into a form of accommodation with each other, whatever particular form that would take. Instead, it's a very destructive paradigm politically. It says that what we need to do is rewind the film of history, which isn't possible always, but that's their program, until we smash the settler-colonial Jewish state and put in its place what they call a de-Zionized one-state solution. The Jews, who would soon be a minority in that state, they tell us, will live in peace and harmony with the Arabs in the state and in the surrounding region. And we all know how well minorities fare in the Middle East. So the paradigm politically takes what is an unresolved, complex national question with a century of experience behind it, which is currently log jammed. I don't have all the answers as to how we move forward, but I do know that treating it as a Hollywood movie in which we simply boo one side and cheer the other, sanctify one side and anathematize the other, creating a cartoon-like picture is not going to help us at all. One of the things it does, for instance, is one of the major obstacles to any kind of a settlement is the political character of the Palestinian national movement. And this is taboo to talk about often. All of the fault is put on the Israeli side. And this paradigm makes that even worse. So the role of the political character of the Palestinian national movement in preventing a solution so far is ignored. Palestinian agency, responsibility, accountability are all denied, swished, pushed aside, and the result is to infantilize the Palestinians. So there's a kind of egging on from the West of all of the worst characteristics of the Palestinian national movement. It's maximalism, it's terrorism, it's Islamism, and so on. There's a silence about a whole series of things. So the interwar anti-Semitic pogroms that took place, the pro-Nazi leadership of al-Husseini, the eulogizing of al-Husseini by Arafat, the role of Muslim anti-Semitism, the Jewish acceptance and the Arab rejection of the 48 UN peace proposal, the invasion of the Arab armies, the nature of Hamas, the fact of the peace process, and the rejection of a series of offers at Camp David, at Tabor, at Annapolis by the Palestinian side. This, by the way, is one of the major moves the demonizers try to make now. They try to erase the fact of the peace process, the fact of the Israeli offers, the fact of the Palestinian rejections, the fact of the Second Intifada. All of this is pushed aside. So what you're left with is this, something that fits with the settler colonialism paradigm, which is this unyielding, racist Israeli state, which stamps the Palestinian under its boot, and so on. So for me, that's why, whatever their intentions, the settler colonialism paradigm is a dead end for the Palestinians. President Biden recently pointed out that what the Palestinians must say unequivocally is that they acknowledge the right of Israel to exist as an independent Jewish state. The settler colonialism paradigm and the kind of Western campus activism it produces pushes the Palestinians in exactly the opposite direction. Now, to end.
Sorry, Alan, you've become muted. Just can you click unmute again?
Yeah, I think, is that okay?
Yeah, just a little bug. Last 10 seconds.
Okay. So I'll make one final point and then finish, which is, who does all of this matter for? It does matter for Israel. I think there's a strategy of the hardcore Western anti-Israel activists. As far as you can make sense of the strategy, it's to abolish Israel in 3 stages. The first stage is intellectual delegitimization. So the settler colonialism framework is part of a system of concepts, which also involves apartheid, ethnic cleansing, Zionism is racism, and so on, which is supposed to intellectually delegitimize the Jewish state until it becomes an international pariah. The second stage is practical isolation. So this is where the BDS movement is supposed to come in and cut Israel off from its allies in the West, so diplomatic isolation, cut it out of the world economy, deny it arms resupply, and demoralize the people because they're banned from the cultural life of the planet. The third stage is abolition. I think the hardcore know that that means the local hard men are free to, with their axes and rockets and missiles, do their thing. But they will say that it's that's when the nirvana of a Jewish experience in a country in which they don't have borders and they don't have ramparts, and the IDF doesn't stand on those ramparts, which I don't even believe that they believe that, because it's so incredible. But that's the strategy. I used to take that a lot more seriously than I do, in the sense that I just don't think any of that's going to happen. The demonizers have influence, but only on the left, amongst liberals, academics, media, and creative elites, and only some of them. Where they can make a lot of noise, they can certainly shape what we experience as opinion, especially online, but I don't think they're anywhere near shaping the policy of governments. BDS is by and large a failure. There's a global and regional stampede to partner up with Israel, with its intelligence, its tech, its cyber, its startups, its inventions, its people, its beaches, its ability to improve the access, especially to Washington for regional states, its ability to strengthen those regional states' shield against Iran and the Shia Crescent. I actually think now the main danger of this discourse, this way of talking about Israel and the experience of the Jews, is us. I actually think the main danger is to the societies of the West. It's part and parcel of a war against the West. It's poisoning the social democratic parties and the liberal parties and the green parties of the West, and helping to make them unelectable. It's causing a rise in left anti-Semitism. Our experience in the British Labour Party with Jeremy Corbyn being one of the main examples of that. It's making parts of Western societies dangerous for Jews. It's poisoning campus life. I saw the kind of resolution that was passed at Melbourne University only recently. And it's poisoning intellectual life too. And in my opinion, it's part of a wider effort to stop us seeing the threat of Islamism playing. I mean, ask the question, why do we get educated graduates marching through London holding up placards which say, we are all Hezbollah now? It's because they've become anti-Western and anti-Israel obsessives who think all resistance to the UK, the US, Israel, and the Western alliances is progressive. At that point, we have a left which literally cannot tell apart the fascistic, which is what Hezbollah are, from the progressive, which is what they think Hezbollah are. Jeremy Corbyn said Hamas and Hezbollah were, quote, leading forces for social justice in the region, end quote, and his friends. Judith Butler, the doyen of cultural studies on American campuses, she said, it's important we see Hamas and Hezbollah as progressive, as part of the global left. I mean, at that point, and for that and a whole host of reasons, basically you can count me out of the left. So to end, I think it's important we oppose all of this for the health of our own Western societies, but also for the continued flourishing of what is the one little Jewish state that exists on a small strip of land on what is still, to this day, a pretty anti-Semitic planet. So thank you, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That's for a very, very comprehensive analysis. So I've got a couple of questions. Michael might have one or two, David, if you have also. But usually by this time of the evening, I've got a few raised hands with questions, but not tonight. So now's your chance. We've got plenty of time. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand electronically. Thank you. Oh, we've already got a couple. Alan, the most staggering thing listening to that, and of course we know this, but the most staggering thing is how there is so little regard for the truth, so little regard for the facts of the situation by the world in general. How do we explain this? Is it just raw anti-Semitism?
I think partly it's a certain form of the politicization of academia. So for instance, if we take the case of Ian Pape, who I've debated with, Ian is very amiable with me. We can talk easily at these events and so on, but we just disagree fundamentally. Ian has written, my aim is the delegitimization of Israel. So I think there's a kind of, what we've covered it a lot in Fathom with Carrie Nelson's articles, especially about the American campus and the world of publishing about Israel. So I think there's a anti-Zionist, anti-Israel politicization of campuses going on. I think that's part of it. I also think in terms of the kinds of ideas that have ravaged the left, and there are a range of them, from authoritarianism to anti-Westernism to identity absolutism, but the other one is relativism, times three, really. Moral relativism, cultural relativism, and relativism about the truth. So, and I think in this debate, there's a huge relativism about the truth also. Basic truths. I can do campus debates in which I can debate with audiences who are decked out in often the paraphernalia of Palestinianism, scarves and badges and so on and so forth. And I can ask them, do you actually know what happened in 1948? And they don't. They don't know what actually happened in 1948. They don't know about the UN plan. They don't know about the Jewish acceptance. They don't know about the Arab rejection. They don't know about the 5 armies invading. They also don't know much about the peace process. So there's a kind of a certain form of politics developing, which is, I would call it expressive politics. So people are expressing a certain identity, usually on the left, to other people on the left. And what's gone right out of fashion, as far as I can see, is a kind of practical, instrumental, reforming politics, which is willing to look at compromise and to look at the actual reality in front of it of two peoples, why they're in conflict, what might be necessary for a solution to emerge. So I actually think a lot of the Western left don't seem that interested in an actual accommodation between the peoples and a peace evolving. They're much more interested in the presentation of self on campus to other left-wingers. So I think all of those reasons are involved, I think.
But Alan, isn't this quite a sad indictment of the education system? Because normally you go through a school system to learn how to look at the truth, discuss it, analyse it, form your opinions. But if you're saying that they're just prepared to discard the truth, what does that say about the education system?
Well, I think I've been out of academia for 10 years, but my daughter has been through a British university since then, and my son, so, and I have contacts, so I know a little bit. It would be over the top to say that British universities have turned into education camps and so on. But I think lecturers are far more willing now to think that they have a political duty to give a certain line to the students and to push that line and to take a very dim view of those students who would disagree with it. We've got an article by Carrie Nelson in this week's Fathom, which talks about developments at the University of California and Illinois, where those universities are now formally passing resolutions making possible departments taking stances on Israel. So a department will make a formal statement saying we're an anti-Zionist department. And Carrie makes the point, it's impossible to imagine it doesn't have to be a Jewish student, any student who thinks they are pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-peace, for instance, who wants to see a two-state solution, who wants to argue that there's reasons on both sides why peace hasn't been reached, who wants to argue that Zionism is a legitimate national movement. How could they possibly argue that in a department in which there's a formal statement up on the notice board saying we are an anti-Zionist department? I'll give you one example of experience of my daughter. I won't name the university. She was writing an essay about Cold War America and McCarthyism and spies and Chambers and Hiss and so on. And she happens to know a lot about it because I know a lot about it. And I've got all the books about it. And I know that Chambers was right and Hiss was lying. And she was able to write an essay which contained this. Now, I know for a fact, reading that essay, it was an essay that was worth something around a first or a high 2-1. It got really marked down. And the lecturer called it something like controversial, which is a journalistic political judgment. What it meant was, look, that's not the kind of thing we want to see written here. So, and I think that's now in a lot of universities, I think that's not such an unusual thing to say.
Okay, now Michael, we'll come to you in a moment. Just before we do, I just want to mention that if you're listening on J-Air, this is the Australian Jewish Association Zoom event, which we have every Wednesday night. Our guest tonight is Professor Alan Johnson from BICOM in the UK. And the topic we're talking about is why Israel is not a settler society. I'll just very quickly hand back to David for a moment to tell us what's coming up next week.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Firstly, I'll make the usual message that if there's anyone on the Zoom who's not yet supporting AJA, once we're finished this evening, please go to the website jewishassociation.org.au, sign up for membership, make a donation, join the email list. Only takes a few seconds. For news and views on a daily basis, like and follow the AJA Facebook page. Now, coming up next week, perhaps on a related subject, we have Professor Abraham Sion, who's associated with Ariel University, who's written a book, To Whom Was the Promised Land Promised? And we'll be looking at it particularly from an international legal perspective. And we have a special event actually on tomorrow evening, also in association with Ariel University. You can get information on the AFAU Facebook page, which is the Australian Friends of Ariel University. There's a special women's health event on tomorrow evening, no charge, just part of our relationship with that particular university.
Okay, thanks, David. Now we've got lots of hands up, but Michael's going to kick off the question. So Michael, please unmute yourself if you are muted and ask your question.
Yes, hi Alan, it's great to speak to you again. We follow your work.
Hi Michael, thank you.
Alan, back in 1947, the United Nations, backed by the majority of the international community, including Australia and Russia, passed a resolution 181 endorsing a two-state solution. As we all know, the Arab and Muslim world up until today has rejected the umpire's decision and a two-state solution. Today, as far as most world politicians and Jewish communal organizations go, their default position on the Israeli-Palestinian Arab conflict is still a two-state solution. Now, you're a neutral observer and more than aware of the history of this conflict. How realistic is a two-state solution? will any Palestinian leader have the will or power to ever implement it? And from Israel's point of view, if by miracle this did happen, wouldn't a Palestinian state just be another belligerent terror state on Israel's doorstep?
Thanks. So I've been a two-stater since the mid-1980s, when I first started really thinking about this. The context of that, by the way, is that the entire British left were in favor of what they would call a democratic secular state, essentially a kind of PLO position. And the group that I was involved in rethought everything in the mid-80s and declared itself for the two-state solution at the same time as we were working with the Union of Jewish Students to stop the far left banning Jewish societies on campuses as Zionist, as therefore racist, you say. This has been going on a very, very long time. So I've always been a two-stater. As editor of Fathom, I think I would go as far as to say I don't think any other journal has published more articles of a constructive expert kind on the two-state solution than we have. It's all pulled together in an ebook, by the way, which I think has like 300 pages and maybe like 50 or more articles. Even this week, we've got Colby Huberman, who's an expert, talking about how you can use the Abraham Accords to build up a regional umbrella framework to make possible at least the beginnings of a movement back to the two sides talking. So all that's the case. I would now distinguish between what I call the two-state solution as a political horizon and the two-state solution as a practical policy in the immediate term. As a horizon, I still support it in the sense that I still think that there are two peoples. I think they're both homeland peoples. I think, therefore, they have the right to national self-determination. I think it's democratic for people to be able to express that national right to self-determination. And I think both peoples want sovereignty. Well, one of the things the one staters simply ignore is the fact that neither of the peoples wants that. They both want a sovereign state of their own in which to express their own peoplehood. I think it still remains the only solution which has international support, therefore huge financial support. And it also is the solution which has a lot of regional support potentially, especially in the context of the Abraham Accords and so on. So as a political horizon, I still support it and I would still work for it. And I think peace building initiatives, which we've done a lot of work on at Fathom, are very important for that, and I would support them fully. Is it an option for now? What I would say is no. I don't think if I was advising the Israeli government, I would be advising it to get out of the West Bank. I don't think there's a Palestinian leadership at the moment which is capable of delivering the kind of guarantees on security, on demilitarization, and on coexistence that would be necessary. Obviously, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are out of that altogether. So we're talking about to what extent it's possible to talk to Fatah. They don't look like they're in a position where they can sit down with anybody. Look, if you look at the offer that was made by Olmert at Annapolis, it's kind of fantastic. that offer, it's almost impossible to imagine that kind of offer being made today. What was it? 96.5 of the West Bank, land swaps on equivalence, a land bridge between Gaza and the West Bank, international superintendents of the holy places and so on. It's not even clear that that was supported at the time it was made by the Israeli people. Olmert was probably in advance of where the Israeli people were at that point. And it was rejected, and Abbas walked away from it. And when Abbas spoke to the New York Times sometime later, he explained he did so because the gaps were great. And I spoke to Benny Bagan in London many years ago, and he said to me, he said, look, if the Palestinians couldn't accept the Olmert offer, there's no offer they could ever accept, as far as we're aware. So it seems to me there needs to be some kind of a political transformation goes on in the Palestinian national movement, which moves itself from a paradigm of resistance to a paradigm of nationalism, if you like. I actually think in some ways Salam Fayyad was probably the last Palestinian nationalist in a kind of Ben Gurion sense of, we take a postage stamp and go from there. Salam Fayyad was an actual Palestinian nationalist. And because he realized he needed to talk to Israelis and the international community in such a way that you could come to an accommodation. I don't think there's a lot of Salam Fayyads around that I see. So I'm very pessimistic at the moment about the possibility of a deal, but I see no alternative going forward as a political horizon to work for. In the meantime, there's people like Mika Goodman who talk about, in the meantime, the conflict can be shrunk as far as possible. They talk about shrinking the conflict, making life much better in the interim, managing the conflict in the interim, and looking for opportunities and waiting for that transformation that I talked about. So, but to be honest with you, after having been interested in this since the mid-'80s, I'm just very pessimistic at the moment about the prospect of a two-state solution. Very, very pessimistic.
I think most of us would agree with you, Alan, and your comments have certainly triggered a storm on the chat. So, but we can always come back to that, but I don't think we've got time. Now we'll open it up for questions. The first three I've got are Philip, Joseph, and Steve. So Philip, we'll start with you. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi. Thanks for your insightful analysis there, Professor. My question is, if you accept the settler-colonial paradigm and compare it to other lands like America, Britain, and Australia, why does that necessarily mean you have to demonize and illegitimize Israel? We don't find anybody trying to demonize the US or delegitimize all those other settler type countries.
Yeah, it's a good question. And the answer that would be given by Ian Pape, for instance, is that it's too late for the other ones. His analysis is that when settler colonial societies over many decades establish themselves as immovable, and they recreate the society as they wish to do so in their own image and so on, it's kind of impossible to rewind the film of history. They think it's not impossible to rewind the film of history in the Israeli case. They think with a combination of delegitimization, BDS, diplomatic isolation, Israel can be persuaded, however, to rewind the film of history until there is no longer a sovereign Jewish entity in the area. It's now a, however they want to put it, democratic secular state, one-state solution, and so on. So they think they've still got a shot at rewinding the film. That's right. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Joseph, please unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry. And so the world's oldest family feud continues into the future for who knows how long. But one perhaps left field type of question for you, Professor, is Israel's history began over 3,000 years ago when the Jews crossed into Israel after leaving Egypt. It seems to me that, and then they subsequently subdued a lot of the so-called tribes in Israel, and the wars continued for quite some time until Israel gained ascendancy and their homeland. I'm just wondering why that aspect of Israeli history is not mentioned more often in current debates, rather than Israel being granted access to its homeland in 1948. Could we perhaps use this and turn the situation around and actually call the Palestinians colonizers or attempt to colonize Israel?
Yeah, I don't know if people have noticed online in the last few days, there's been a series of people reposting front pages of newspapers from 1947 and 48, and a lot of the newspapers had the headline "Arabs invade Palestine." So, but and you get this phenomena of Mahmoud Abbas, Arafat, and others, and then the UN endorsing it, or sort of denying the links of the Jewish people to the land and even to the holy places and so on. It's a phenomena, absolutely. So that's why I started, I think, with that point first of all, which is that the overriding and fundamental difference is that the Jewish people are a homeland people returning to a homeland, which is not the case in any of the other so-called settler colonial societies. And my view is that, and there's an Israeli academic called Chaim Gans who wrote a book, The Political Theory of Jewish People, who makes a lot of that as well. He's trying to reach out to progressives, and he's trying to say, look, you need to understand you're dealing with two homeland peoples who are trying to come to an accommodation. And the conflict, the context of the conflict is in part produced by European anti-Semitism. So what we want to do is to try to help the two peoples to come to that accommodation, whichever form it takes. But first of all, you need to understand this is a homeland people returning, not a white European settler invasion of a foreign land. So yeah, I agree with you absolutely. We should be making that point much more forcefully. I agree.
Thank you. Steve, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks, Alan, and thank you, Professor, for your thoughts. I just wanted to talk about the fact that the paradigm when talking about a peace process is to assume that we're talking about a peace process between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs. I think one of the great achievements of the Trump administration was to introduce a new paradigm, which is a process of peace between Israel and the region with the Abraham Accords. And unfortunately, the Biden administration seems to be wanting to take us back to the tired old paradigm. But I'd be interested, Professor, in your comments on this alternative view, the regional peace process, as opposed to the process of peace between Israel and just the PLO, and specifically, what can we as diaspora Jews do to promote that view and to reduce the level of attention that's given to this Palestinian issue, which I think regionally is quite a minor issue.
Thanks, Steve. I certainly think if the Palestinian national movement, here I am as an advisor, my advice would be to take the regional approaches very, very seriously and to do so very quickly, because the kinds of strategies that have been followed in the last period are running out of road. More and more states are less and less interested in expending any political capital on anything other than a regionally based, peaceable approach to accommodating the two people. So there's a kind of political dead end there for the Palestinians. I agree entirely about the importance of the regional framework. I actually think the Biden administration has downplayed the Abraham Accords in a really, really unhelpful way. And I think they've done so because, as American politics often works, one guy comes in and trashes most of what the other guy previously did, or doesn't want to give it too much credit and so on. I think it's a huge opportunity for peace to take seriously the Abraham Accords and the kinds of partnerships which are emerging between regional Arab states and the Israelis, in part because it balances out the kind of, the relationship between Israel and America. To the extent that it was balanced out between the relationship between the Palestinians and the Europeans, it never really amounted to much because the Palestinians understand that the Europeans in that calculation are not that important. But I think it's different if you can add regional Arab states to it. So that's very important. As I say, in Fathom this week, we've got Kobe Huberman writing a major article about how that could be done in practical terms, how the Abraham Accords can be leveraged in order to create a regional umbrella for some kind of a return to talks. As BICOM, we organized talks in London between Palestinians and Israelis, people who'd been involved in the previous peace process negotiations. And we spent 3 or 4 days in a hotel together, and it was Chatham House rules. So without going into the detail, there was a lot of interest from the Palestinians who were there and the Israelis in the regional framework initiative. So I think it has got more potential than others in terms of, you know, getting back to talks that can't involve Hamas. One of the problems is, you know, the Palestinians are a divided national movement, unable to speak in a single voice, and a good part of it is dominated by a radical terrorist Islamist organization who is essentially, you know, committed to some form of eliminationist anti-Semitism. So Israel at the moment can talk to a part of the Palestinian national movement, but not more than that. So I agree with you. It's an important way forward, and it should be absolutely be pursued. The Americans should be much more enthusiastic about it than they are. Yeah, it's one way to keep alive the paradigm of peace process.
Thank you. Now we'll take a written question from Robert, and then we've got Gary and Jason, and hopefully Brian and Saul.
All right, so we've got a few questions. I'll just ask you, you spoke about the Trump deal. Just a question, what are your thoughts on the deal of the century? So the roadmap between Israel and the Arabs that Trump proposed, is there any potential there?
I think the Palestinians should have engaged, and I think they should have engaged much earlier. They should have gone to DC and talked. One of the tricks the Palestinians often miss in the peace process has been the Israelis' attitude to almost anything that happens in the peace process is yes, but. They realize what's wrong with simply saying no to an American administration. So they will often say, well, yes, but hold on, let's start talking. And then they raise objections, they ask for changes, but they stay involved. The Palestinians have not taken that kind of approach, and they didn't with the Trump deal either. So they wrote themselves out of that, which I thought was a huge mistake. I didn't think the Trump deal showed enough of a recognition of bringing the Palestinians on board, listening to Palestinian concerns, even if they weren't being made in the way they should have been in DC. So I think it was very unlikely that the deal was going to go very far with the Palestinians. And I don't think that was even necessary. I think he had regional support for the deal. He had his Israeli willingness to talk. So I don't think it was necessary for him to kind of shut the Palestinians out in the way that he did from the start. And I don't think it was necessary for them to refuse to engage. So I think somewhere back to the talks is very difficult to envisage at the moment, but I think it has to involve more involvement of the Palestinians' leadership than the Trump deal did.
Sure. Gary, please unmute yourself. Oh, Robert, did you have anything else, or was that it? I'm sorry.
Just ask another quick one. How come we don't hear enough about Arab and Muslim colonialism, the history of it? Why isn't there enough focus on that? It's a very colonial culture.
Well, funny, as you ask that, I'm reading a book at the moment by someone, acquaintance, Douglas Murray's War on the West. And, you know, Douglas has a very long part of the book, second part on slavery, which is really worth reading. And he does highlight this, that it isn't just about colonialism. If you take slavery, for instance, there's an absence of a discussion of centuries of the Eastern slave trade, and only the Western slave trade is discussed. So I think it's a problem of contemporary intellectual culture. It's an issue that is part of a kind of down with us attitude, a kind of culture of resentment in the West, in which we seem incapable of balancing a robust defense of Western values and Western achievement against a necessary self-criticism of Western sins, if you want to put it that way. And I think the book is valuable because it tries to call for, in a very eloquent way, a rebalancing of that. And I think in the absence of that rebalancing, we get this phenomena for certain of only one kind of colonialism being taken into account. You see, one of the problems at the moment in Western intellectual life is that if you take, for instance, the questions of racism and so on, it's said that racism is power plus prejudice. So therefore, in the absence of being the most powerful group, it's said that you can't actually be racist. And I think it's this crude approach which really makes historical understanding very difficult, which is part of our problem. So it often ends up with the left being supportive of tyrannies of one kind or another, simply because they're opposed to the West. The West is seen as the only problem, and any resistance to the West is seen as progressive. I mean, some people call it campism, which I think is a good term. There's a good camp and a bad camp. And in any one situation, you have to support the good camp against the bad Western camp. Where it actually commits the left to a lot is support for a series of thugs, dictators, Islamists, misogynists, militarists, and so on, who they end up critically supporting against the West, which is an intellectual disaster for the left. But there it is. That's the situation we're in.
Okay. Now let's say we've got Gary. Please unmute yourself, and we're coming up to time, so we'll try and keep them brief. Gary, are you unmuting yourself? Okay, there you are.
Now, I wasn't able to for a moment. Thanks for dropping in your talk. A lot of surprises in it. The history of it, a few times I've been able to break through with conversation with people, break through that paradigm of settler by framing it as one of the local civil wars left over from World War I, when the empires broke down and nations formed, and compared it to, say, the way Slovakia and Czech Republic solved their issues. Yugoslavia was another. It led to a range of other interesting ways to discuss that background and break down that paradigm of Jews don't really have a right there. Would you like to address that way of framing it?
Well, you mentioned the Czechs and the Slovaks. I often use their recent experience as an example of why the one-state solution isn't really going to fly, because if you think of the contrast, the Jews and the Palestinians have been at war with each other in various forms for over a century. The Czechs and the Slovaks were essentially getting on very well in the Velvet Revolution. But nonetheless, as soon as they're given the opportunity, they decided, if it's okay with you, we'll just separate and we'll have our own sovereign state so we can express our collective identity. So the idea that that is not going to be the case with the Israel-Palestine conflict, to me, is one of the reasons I still support the two-state solution as a political horizon, is that I simply don't see any solution which involves anything short of a serious expression of collective identity and sovereignty by both peoples. I think, by the way, and I'm going to go into dreamland now a little bit, if that was ever achieved with regional support and international support, and you go through maybe a generation of there not being major conflict between the two peoples, all sorts of things become imaginable at that point. Economic cooperation, cultural interchanges, and the rest of it. But that's not where we're at. But yeah, in terms of your question about, a civil war, yeah, the history of the conflict. Here's what I think. One of the things that's missing from a lot of intellectual culture today is any sense of the tragic. It's a soundbite culture and a kind of online culture and a kind of boo and hooray culture and so on. And it's kind of an infantile intellectual culture. So the actual tragic history of the two peoples, both in their own way, by the way, victims of Europe in various ways, and how one deals with a tragic, unresolved national question and the kind of grown-up politics that are required to deal with such a situation. I mean, sometimes I despair these days because most of that is now just out of the window, and we have just a series of slogans. I mean, I literally could cry at the sight of students marching around chanting "from the river to the sea" and not really understanding the conflict or where it came from or how a tangled history produced it and what kind of political sophistication is necessary to untangle that conflict. So anything that gets us away from a sloganizing approach to the conflict is, for me, would be a good thing.
Okay, and very quickly we'll take Jason because he's been waiting a long time. So Jason, please unmute and ask your question.
Very quickly then, so everything that I've heard here tonight indicates that, if I'm wrong, or correct me if I'm wrong, that the relativism you speak of is really encapsulated in the United Nations. That's probably the biggest problem of all, in more than just this area. The cost benefit of the Western nations and the nations that are involved in the Abraham Accords, what are the costs and benefits of them just telling the UN what to go do with itself and forming another group, another United Nations, as it were? I mean, that's a huge question, I know, but what are your thoughts?
Well, if you go back about, when was it? Maybe 10 years or so, I wrote a series of pieces for various British publications, Progress and others, and I debated with Paddy Ashdown in the Commons and elsewhere, and spoke to the Americans about it. I used to be in favour, and I still am in theory, of a League of Democracies. Again, in terms of the, it's possible to have serious people in politics say, we shouldn't go to war anywhere unless the UN Security Council agrees it. We shouldn't do X or Y until the UN Security Council agrees it. And then you simply point out to them, so in other words, you're going to cede your foreign policy to the CCP and Putin. And at that point, rather than just say, oh, you're right, I'm wrong, we can't do that. They kind of hum and haw and well, we shouldn't go alone and so on. And yeah, I agree. There's a lot of rubbish spoken about the degree to which it's reasonable to allow the UN Security Council to dictate anything to anybody, given you have four barbaric forces on there in the form of the Chinese Communist Party and in the form of the man who's currently invaded Ukraine and committing war crimes there. So yeah, so I would be in favor of, I'm not in favor of anyone withdrawing from the UN, but I'm certainly in favor of Western nations such as our own beginning to talk much more seriously to each other. And if that could take some institutional framework, I think that would be a very good thing. I mean, immediately could take the form of a more organized caucus and say the UN and the UN Security Council and General Assembly and its bodies, by the way, that's another idea that's muted, that, there's the Islamic Alliance and so on, and the non-aligned movement that's been, and maybe there should be a more organized Western caucus inside the UN that's able to coordinate its positions and its.
Yeah, okay. Now we have gone a couple of minutes over time, so we'll call it quits there. Sorry to Brian and Saul. Alan, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We really covered two areas tonight. Firstly, the truth of the situation regarding Israel, and then how this can best be addressed. So you're doing a marvellous job, and I want to thank you. I note the awkwardness, or a little awkwardness when discussing, how to move forward and the two-state solution. I think our group would probably say you're barking up the wrong tree, but we say thank you for trying, and we're pleased that at least you're spreading the good word out there. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, just before we go, I'll mention that the L'Chaim program with Maurice Klein is on now, and this week, because of our impending election, he has one-on-one interviews with all the candidates for Goldstein, including Zoe Daniels. So that's the L'Chaim program on 3ZZZ. But that's all we have for tonight. Join us next week with Professor Abraham Sion, and we're going to discuss to whom was the promised land promised. Don't forget, you can keep up to date with what the AJA is talking about on our Facebook page. Please like it and share it widely. But for now, we wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you again next week as usual. Bye for now, and thanks again, Alan. Nice to see you again.